Continuing from the previous progress, a good next increment is to think about what components we need in this app. Should we, for example, extract the helpline into its own header component maybe, or is that a not needed abstraction? Should we make the stars section a component? We can also implement this whole app with a single component, but that would leave us with a really big component. We need to start thinking about splitting responsibilities. Here's the thing. Too few or too many components are both bad. You need a good balance here. Let me give you one important pointer to identify a good candidate for a component. Every time in the UI you have many items that share similar data or behavior, that's a candidate for an item component. The play numbers here will have the exact same behavior. Each click on a number will invoke logic to determine if that click is good or bad. The numbers are going to invoke this behavior with different data, but the nature of the behavior is similar. So this is a good clue that we should extract a play number into a component. Let's do that. I'll take this part and get back here once I'm done designing the component. Okay, what's a good name for this component? Let's call it maybe number. Each React component will receive a set of props, and we'll make it return the exact same value that we had before. So now back in here, we do number, and this number will need to receive the property of which number to display. So let's just pass it here as a prop. Number is number, and because it's now a prop, in here I can access it as props.number. I don't need the key here anymore. The key is needed on the immediate element in the loop, this thing in here. So let's cut this part and put it back in here and make sure things are still working. Cool. Here's an important question now. What is wrong with what I just did? Just because what I did is working doesn't make it right. One part of the change I just made is fundamentally wrong, and you should be able to identify it. And I'm talking about this number name. By naming my component number, I am actually overriding the native number class that's available in JavaScript. This number constructor is used in JavaScript to convert a string into a number. For example, say that these edges of the random range are received for some reason as strings. If you just use them as strings here, things will not work as expected. So one solution is to call the number constructor on this to change it into a number. But guess what? This will not work now because I've named my component number. So in here, I am not using the number constructor anymore. I am using the component I just made. So this is bad. Be aware of the top level JavaScript objects in your scope and do not override them. A good way to avoid this conflict is to always name your components with 2 words instead of 1. Maybe we call it play number instead of number, which means we need to change this into play number. And now this number call here is using the native JavaScript number. Okay, now that we have a shared component to represent a single number, we can define behavior on this number. Let's go ahead and define an on-click behavior. We need to identify when a number is clicked. So I'll inline an arrow function here and just use a console.log line that we have clicked on a number. So we need props.number here. And let's test this change. Click around and make sure the number values are being reported. Here's an important question for you. How exactly is this working? We have a function here, and this function gets invoked on each click. What is the JavaScript concept that's at play here that makes this click handler access the value of each number? The onClick handler is a function within another function, the playNumber function. So focusing on just the play numbers, we created 9 top functions and then 9 click handler functions in them. So what is making all this work? And the answer is JavaScript closures. Each onClick function here closes over the scope of its owner number and give us access to its props. We have 9 onClick handlers and they all have different closures closing over different scopes. This is important to understand and remember when working with stateful function components in React because they do depend on closures. And this could also be a source of bugs later on if we forget to refresh the scope of a closure. So you just need to start identifying when closures are being used in your function components. Okay, what other components should we extract? So the concept behind extracting a plain number here is reusability. We want to make a plain number reusable and define some shared behavior on it. The other guideline for extracting components is readability and making components smaller in general. An example of this would be here. This part here is displaying stars, but that information is not immediately visible. I could make this part a little bit more readable by rendering a component here. Maybe we call this one stars display. And stars display is a simple component that receives props and return what we had before. But now we have a list of adjacent items here. So we need to make this into a single element because every React component needs to render a single element. Now, if we don't want to introduce any new element nesting in the tree, we could just use the React fragment concept and wrap this whole thing with an empty JSX tags here that represents a React.fragment. The other challenge about this change is we previously had access to the number of stars when we were here, but now we added another level of abstraction. So we need to flow down the number of stars to the stars display. And it doesn't have to be the exact same name. I could say this is just the count of how many stars to display, and this count can be assigned to stars. And now in here, instead of stars, the range is props.count. I still need the key here because that is the dynamic child inside the map. But with that, let's test this change, and things seems to be working. Now you can definitely think about extracting more components out of this star match component, but just don't overdo it. Let's just run with these 3 components for now and focus more on the interactions between them. So let's start thinking about the next React concept here, which is how to make the UI an exact description of all the state elements in this app. We've already made the UI describe how to render a number of stars, but that's only one state element. We have more. We need to think about picking a number next.